Hi, so I think we can start now. I'll just begin with a very quick introduction. My name is Juvaria Jafri. I will be hosting today's session on global North wars and the global South perspectives on the Russian war on Ukraine. The original plan was to co-host with Inderjeet Parmar, but unfortunately he can't make it. So it's just us for the session today. Now, just to give you a little background on the session, since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, numerous scholars have tried to make sense of what this means for the liberal international order. Understandably, most of these commentaries draw on the perspectives of those from Ukraine or Russia or the CIS, particularly those who offer critical perspectives on the Western response to Russian aggression. In today's session, we take a slightly different approach. We engage with voices from the global South and explore how perspectives may differ. Our overarching objective is to address asymmetries in global knowledge production. This is part of a broader initiative to think differently about the world, its different regions, societies, and to connect with streams of thought, ideas, and thinkers, scholars, and experience from around the world. As you might already know, this is a 90-minute session. We have 6 speakers who I will introduce just in a few minutes. We will have time for Q&A, and if you wish to ask a question, you can use the Q&A option on Zoom. You can also raise your hand, and we can sort of bring you into the session so you can ask your question yourself if you wish. There are 2 options, and we hope you'll find the session interesting and engaging. Now, let me introduce our speakers. We have with us Hassan. Hassan is an associate professor in the Politics and International Studies Department at the University of Warwick. His publications include a monograph, articles, and book chapters in the areas of American and European foreign and security policy, Middle Eastern politics, democratization theory, and constructivism in international relations. We also have with us Dr. Ahmed Waheed, who is the executive director of the Rhodes Initiative. That's an acronym for research on advancement and development of the social sciences. It's based in Pakistan. His publications include 2 books, The Wrong Ally, Pakistan's State Sovereignty Under US Dependence, and the second book, Constructing Pakistan Through Knowledge Production in International Relations and Area Studies. We also have with us today Urvashi Sarkar. She's a freelance journalist based in Mumbai in India, and she's an editorial fellow with Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. She has reported on various issues, including foreign policy and think tanks, climate change, refugee issues, education, nuclear policy, and the United Nations. And her work has been published widely, including in Caravan Magazine, Al Jazeera, Himal South Asian, Scroll.in, The Wire, People's Archive of Rural India, News Laundry, The Print, and various other outlets. We're also very pleased with us today to have Professor Raul Rodriguez. Rodriguez joins us from the University of Havana, where he's director at the Center for Western Hemispheric and United States Studies, and his research interests are in imperialism, hegemony, and American power, and his publications include journal articles and book chapters on the foreign policy and diplomatic relations of the United States, Canada, and Cuba. We also have with us today David Adler, who is the general coordinator for Progressive International, which is a network of political parties, trade unions, and social movements around the world. And in the past, he has served as foreign policy advisor for Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, and his work on internationalism and international institutions has been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, and other outlets. We also have with us today Atul Bhardwaj, who is an independent researcher and a writer based in India. He's published several papers in refereed journals and edited books, and also several articles and commentaries in leading international and national newspapers, including Economic and Political Weekly and The Frontline. He's also the author of the book, India-America Relations, 1942 to 62, Rooted in the Liberal International Order, published by Routledge. We're very pleased to have this diverse group here with us today. And we can begin the session now with commentary from Professor Olsen.
Super, thanks Juvaria, and thanks for organizing. So in my sort of 10 minutes, I'm going to try and go through as much of this as I can, particularly talking about the views from the Middle East and how the conflict's playing out there. And in part, I think that, you know, we need to understand the Middle East as sort of sitting sort of very much central, but outside of this conflict. but the in large part things are sort of feeding in that have been happening over the last decade since Russia really announced its sort of global plans and the idea that it's going to become a sort of global power again. So in that sense, we can sort of begin to sort of look at the Middle East perspective really as one where the region itself is entwined with both the sort of the sort of US and EU on one side, and on the other side, Russian interests as well. And what that's meant is that really the governments in the Middle East have really pursued and have tried to build around themselves a series of neutrality. The idea, if we go back to sort of February 27th, is that Egypt, when it asked for a special meeting of the Arab League, decided that, you know, having a neutral position was very much part and parcel of how the region was going to respond to this crisis. And then on February 28th, you had a sort of dialogue released, and a statement of neutrality that really talked about how diplomacy was going to be key to this, and how a ministerial contact group with Russia was going to be set up to try and alleviate a lot of the issues around the conflict. So in that sense, we can understand the region as trying to balance both its interests, but also at the same time maintain issues around sovereignty and the implications for their own states. But that, of course, is the sort of government neutral position. On the other hand, what you have is various media organizations, particularly pro-media organizations, who are very sympathetic to Russia and the Russian justification of why this conflict has occurred. In fact, if you sort of go through, say, for example, Egyptian media organizations, you can begin to see that a lot of the misinformation and a lot of the sort of Russian narrative gets passed quite easily without questioning into how the conflict's being seen. So in that sense, you've got a really contrasting approach, and it tells you a lot about, you know, the narrative that we get from Russia, the sort of performative action that Russia's going through at the United Nations isn't very much targeted to a Western audience that largely regard what's being said as preposterous. It's really being targeted at sort of media organizations elsewhere. And at the same time as you've got that going on, you've got media organizations in the region also pointing out the sort of hypocrisy between the way in which, for example, refugees have been treated. So, for example, Poland in November 2001 used sort of 20,000 troops or so forth on the Belarus-Poland border to sort of push back 4,000 refugees. But over the last 5 weeks has accepted hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians that the Polish minister has referred to as intelligent and educated. And that's really sort of pointing out a sort of underlying set of racism that's going on, and this idea that's sort of playing out in Middle Eastern media that somehow that refugees from the region are less deserving than European refugees. At the same time as that, you've also got the Palestinian narrative playing out, whereby contrasts are quite clearly being made about the way in which the Ukrainian forces repelling Russian aggression are being talked about and treated differently to the way in which the Palestinians are spoken of. And so what this is sort of playing into is, although you've got government neutrality, you've got, on the other hand, media organizations in the region sort of pointing out, you know, issues of race and civilization and so forth. So in that sense, what are some of the other sort of narratives that we can pull out? Well, first off, I think that in large part, this is helping to feed into this idea from the region that actually this is a European crisis. This is Europe's problem. It's a European security order problem. And that actually what the region's going to do, what various powers are going to do with neutrality, is try and weather out the crisis without trying to undermine their interests with both Russia and the West. So in that sense, then, although this crisis is causing enormous damage to the region, both if in terms of inflation, like both the energy price inflation and food price inflation, it's also causing a whole range of problems with economies through the absence of tourism and so forth. But if we were to sort of break this down into the issues that really affect the region, I mean, the primary one here is, and on a domestic scale, is really the agri-food trade system, right? So the Middle East is the top destination for Russian food exports. I think Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey made up, certainly over the last decade, about 2/3 of all sort of Russian purchases of food. And these are really affected by bilateral political relationships. So what the region is sort of saying is that actually, on the one hand, Europe won't give up energy. Why is Europe expecting us to sort of hold up sanctions and effectively create food problems for ourselves when we need wheat, barley, maize, sunflower oil, and so forth? Particularly as since 2015 and 16, Russia has really replaced the United States as the main wheat and food importer in the region. That makes up around 30% of all imports. I think that was 2019. So in that sense, food is really the most important bilateral relationship on a domestic level. And it plays out particularly well in places like Egypt, where Egypt is the world's largest importer of wheat on the planet, and it's very much part of a stable and subsidized bread program for the region. It doesn't want to upset. On a more sort of regional level, I think that what's interesting and how Russia is sort of being able to sort of play this and balance out with regional powers is really, some of the other issues that have been going on over the last decade are coming to fruition. So on a regional level, you've got the gravity of the Syria crisis, where in fact Israel is hedging its bets with Russia because it needs cooperation for airspace in over Syria. You've got Turkey that's very much entwined and very much looking at its interests in Syria as well. And you've also got regimes like Egypt looking at the post-Arab Spring environment and saying, well, actually, Russia, the way it stepped in for Syria to protect the Assad regime, has really shown that it's a more stable and reliable partner and security guarantor than the United States is, because ultimately the United States it looks to be turning away from the region. At the same time as that, you've got Egypt sort of saying, like, actually, if we look at sort of our interests in Libya and the civil war there, we can balance with Russia and cooperate there. You've also got increasing energy cooperation with OPEC and the OPEC Plus system, because of the way in which the US shale revolution is challenging the dominance of the other big two, Russia and Saudi Arabia, when it comes to energy. And you've got things like, Algeria, who imports most of its arms and trade from Russia. And so what you're getting here is this complex mix of the sort of fallout from Syria and the Arab Spring, energy cooperation, arms exports, and food that really are trying to make the Middle East sort of balance out. And I think what in the sort of final minute I've got, that we can see how this is playing out in the General Assembly. So, for example, even though this the 2nd of March vote, the ES11 won about the Russian withdrawal, occurred after the Arab League discussions, that was very much part of a sort of set of G7 pressure to sort of say, actually, sovereignty is really important. But if we look yesterday, Russia being suspended from the Human Rights Council, in favor, you've got Israel, Libya, and Turkey. Against, you've got Algeria, Iran, and Syria, as you'd expect, and the rest of the Middle East sort of really just falling down into abstaining. So Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, very much going forward. And I'll probably stop there because my alarm is telling me my 10 minutes are up.
Great, thanks, Oz. That was great. We actually have a question from one of the participants who's raised their hand.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to see if we can allow them to talk if this works. Hi, Joyce, are you there? It doesn't seem to be working.
Joyce, you should be able
Joyce
to
is
unmute
muted.
yourself now.
I don't think it's working. We can probably try in a bit again, but for now, should we just move on to the next panelist?
Okay. Yep.
Dr. Waheed?
Yeah, thank you so much. Can you hear me? Is it all right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so I think before I go forward, for the attendees, a little brief understanding about why this is such an important topic, and why this has now become a matter of concern. A little specifics on that. So the 2nd March in the UNGA emergency session, you had 141 countries voting in favor, 35 abstentions and 5 votes. But so overwhelmingly, a lot of countries opposed the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But what that hides is the US sanction map tells a very different story. So, for example, close to half of all Asian African countries abstained, and even in the recent yesterday, the Russian removal from the Human Rights Council, you had 93 in favor, 24 against, and 58 abstentions, which is around 82 countries. So there is a very thin margin between those who voted for Russian removal and those who did not vote for Russian removal. Now, the problem I think here is, as the discussion suggests, that why isn't the South wholesomely contributing towards this Western resolve to thwart Russian aggression, or to halt it, or to condemn it as openly as possible? I think that this is a very multifaceted and a multidimensional question, not only because different regions have experienced US alliances differently, or US relationship different. For example, Latin American experience of the United States is very different from Middle Eastern ones, and Middle Eastern ones are very different from South Asian ones. I mean, one of the most interesting bit was that yesterday, none of the South Asian countries voted for the United States, so most of them were absented from it. I think there are many arguments that one can make why, for example, Oz spoke about geostrategic situations. A lot of articles, a lot of reviews of the situation have looked at how India has, close military ties with Russia, and it does not want to upset Russians. Israel has strategic reasons. Saudi Arabia and UAE, they're part of the global oil market. Turkey, backs Russian action in Libya and Azerbaijan, etc. And then there's an argument that there's a rise of non-alignment, for different reasons. I think what all this does is it kind of hides the fact that the US policy during the Cold War and the US policy after the Cold War are actually responsible for why the South has now taken a backseat when it comes to its views on Ukraine and US, move towards trying to counter Russia in the region. That is because during the Cold War, while the third world states and the countries were very concerned about their sovereignty, however, interventionist agendas were ripe, and all the states were up for grab between two different poles, that of the Soviet Union and the United States of America, with the dissolution of Soviet Union heralding the the rise of the new global world order, and the in terms of Fukuyama, the end of history because of the rise of democracy. I think what the post-Cold War, and the recent war on terror for the South Asian countries particularly Pakistan. What it has done is that it has kind of dismantled the moral foundations on which the US economic order or the US policy stands. So the atrocities that have been part of US policy since 2000 with Afghanistan and Iraq, Libya and Syria, that has affected the way different populations have come to understand what the West has actually, what is the West's understanding of these regions which exist outside Europe. And I think what this non-alignment is, it is basically a new kind of resistance to a US-led Western order. It is a resistance towards Western ideals of democracy, of human rights, because not only the recent incidents of Islamophobia, recent incidents of even American and Western actions towards Ukraine, as opposed to those towards other countries that are not part of the Europe, they have unveiled how the US and the West look at regions that do not comprise the core of world politics, to say. So I think many states in the South have actually backed out or have not sponsored this US-led counter to Russia because, one, they have I lost my train of thought. Anyways, the second point was that why do I feel like a school kid in front of the principal? I mean, does it happen to everybody? I'm a seasoned academic.
I mean, I think
Anyways.
it's absolutely fine because it's a roundtable format, so we can just come back to you if you want to sort of jump in.
It's all right. I'm just about to finish this anyways. So I think what has happened is that the South has actually seen the unveiled face of the Western aggression. And I think because of that, many countries are now backing off. Secondly, because of this multipolarity, the rise of China and Russia, it has become very difficult for US to consolidate sudden coalition against Russia. So yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, great. Thank you. Should we move on to the next panelist then? Urvashi, are you ready?
Yeah, I'll be speaking today from an Indian perspective because that's where I'm based. So the thing is that when we look at this entire conflict between Ukraine and Russia, we see that India has gained importance in this rather faraway conflict because it happens to be one of the few countries which has friendships and good friendships with both the United States and Russia. So the thing is, why does India not want to antagonize Russia? And this is not a new dilemma for India by any means. This began to play out from the years of the Cold War, right from the 1950s or 60s onwards. But even though it was said to be a non-aligned movement, India was arguably much closer to Russia. And Russia had even supported India during the Bangladesh War of 1971. In 1998, when India tested its nuclear weapons, it became practically an international pariah. And the United States, in particular, was particularly unhappy with these tests and had imposed strict economic sanctions on India. But Russia actually still continued to be friends with India and even supplied it with nuclear energy and helped start its nuclear reactors, especially the ones in Kudankulam which is based in the state of Tamil Nadu in India. And if you think about it, despite the much celebrated India-US nuclear deal of 2008, the only the only nuclear reactors which run in the country and are of foreign origin are basically Russia and France, and it's not the United States. It's also well known that the centerpiece of the India-Russia relationship is defense cooperation. So from 2016 to 2020, India was the largest recipient of arms from Russia, and Russia, France, and Israel remained the largest supplier of arms to India during this period. But on the balance, the trade relationship between India and US is much, much larger compared to the one with Russia. There's also a lot more cooperation between India and the United States in fields such as IT services and people-to-people contacts. But it's very interesting to me that India is now a prominent player in this far-off conflict. Perhaps not so far off because we can see how the war between Russia and Ukraine has actually impacted energy prices in India and how the common man suffers because of this. But both the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and US Deputy National Security Advisor Dalip Singh visited India within days or hours of each other because they wanted to impress their case with the Narendra Modi government. But one should also remember that even as the US insists that India is a partner of choice, it did not hesitate to use its national security agency to spy on Indian diplomats in 2014. The then External Affairs Minister had very foolishly and bizarrely defended the US NSA and said that its activities did not constitute snooping and might actually prevent terror attacks. So, since we've been asked to keep this short, I want to come to the core question of whether this is a new phase or a reinvigoration of the non-aligned movement. And to my mind, the answer is no. Because if you look at the India of today, it's very different from the India of the non-alignment movement years. And the peak of the NAM years when Nehru and Sukarno and other leaders were alive, and there was this whole talk and hope around South-South solidarity. Now, if you even mention the word non-alignment movement, if you mention the phrase in India, people will immediately take a back step and talk about phrases like strategic autonomy instead, because I think that's where India is at the moment, where it wants to balance its friends and foes in a very hardcore, realistic fashion and reap the best possible outcomes. So any talk of non-alignment movement or new South-South solidarity is likely to be greeted with a lot of skepticism, especially by the media, by think tanks, and by the entire defense community as well. And the other thing that I want to draw attention to is that India has a very major relationship with Israel. And this wasn't the case during the non-alignment movement years. In fact, India is today one of Israel's biggest supporters and cheerleaders. And this didn't happen. This wasn't the case during the NAM years. Um, India has also lost the goodwill that it used to have with countries like Bhutan and Nepal. Or even if you think about its treatment of Rohingya refugees from Myanmar. So, what you see in terms of Indian foreign policy is a very different Indian foreign policy than compared to the 50s or 60s. What we see is, in fact, a very muscular and self aggrandizing foreign policy. Finally, we also need to see how India behaves and who does it vote with, in bigger forums of climate change, intellectual property, big tech, and e-commerce. I mean, if you actually crunch the data there, you might actually find evidence that India's solidarities aren't what they used to be. Yeah, I'll conclude here.
Great, thanks, Urvashi. We actually have some questions. I'm going to see if we can get Gautam to ask his question live. So let's see if this works this time. Hi, Gautam, can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks.
Yes.
Unmuted, yes.
Hi, are you there?
Yes, I have unmuted. I'm just trying to switch on my video. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for allowing us, sort of inviting me to ask my question. It's a very brief comment, a couple of points, principally to the last submission by Urvashi, if I may. So it was a very, thanks for the very balanced and very matter-of-fact assessment of the Indian position, which I think is absolutely, I think I would agree completely with you. I would just not use the self-aggrandizing, but that's a matter of perception. That's not at all important. But I have a very couple of quick comments to make, if I may, Juvaria. I'll just take a minute. That's not more than that.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you so much. I'll just take half a minute or something, not more than that. And when I say half a minute, I will take half a minute, not more. So I just wanted to say that maybe I'm being a bit optimistic, but a few things have happened since the war was the war started, the war/special military operation, depending on your perspective, started. So one was, we see very interesting developments in Pakistan and the whole of South Asia in general. One of the things one doesn't see being discussed everywhere is that all South Asian countries abstained on the UN Security Council resolution. So Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India. And I think Pakistan's abstention really surprised a lot of people. I'm not an expert on this, so I wouldn't venture forth on why Pakistan abstained, but I would just like to dream, if I may, that this war in Russia and Ukraine might actually lead to a rise in consciousness in South Asia and in the South Asian diaspora, that South Asian interests in the wider world, in this new 21st century global geopolitics, is in more cohesion in at least certain aspects of international politics and international relations. This is one. The second point I would try to make is, Urvashi, your point is very well taken. But I would like to say that for the current policy of strategic autonomy in India, which the Indian MEA, which South Bloc seems to be sort of projecting for a number of years, actually, even before 2014 to a certain extent. I mean, we remember how when an Indian diplomat was actually practically assaulted in New York by an overzealous attorney, the government of India then removed all security roadblocks from the American embassy. So that was a very decisive action. I find mirrors of that sentiment in the statement given by the Prime Minister of Pakistan recently in a rally in Karachi or Lahore, where he said that we are not your slaves. That was, I guess, the boldest statement a Prime Minister of Pakistan has made against it. So my point is, I'd conclude by saying, when one talks of strategic autonomy for India, and I would say a certain amount of strategic autonomy for the whole South Asian region, one should realize that ideationally, ideologically, in terms of ideas, non-alignment is a very key thing, because South Asian strategic autonomy in the broader world can be enriched by accepting non-alignment as an overarching policy, theoretical, political goal. That's the only thing I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. No, those are excellent points. So I think we can just come back to the point on what we really mean by strategic autonomy. There's also a question in the Q&A about non-alignment. So I think those are really interesting themes that we should definitely explore within this session. But Gautam, can you just quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Dr. Gautam Chakrabarti. I'm a cultural studies scholar. I work in the European University of Viadrina near Berlin, Germany. So my work is on the cultural Cold War across Eastern Europe and South and Southeast Asia. So, but I also am writing a book on espionage fiction during the Cold War. So that's
Okay, great, thanks. That's great. So I hope we'll have some more questions. We will come back to some of the points that Gautam raised right now, but for now, can we move on to our third speaker, please, who is Professor Raul Rodriguez.
Okay, can you hear me? Everyone?
Yeah, we can hear you very clearly, Raul.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the invitation and to participate in this conversation. I will shift a little bit from East Asia to Latin America and the Western Hemisphere. A bit of a geographical shift. It's my region of the world. That's what we mostly do. But first, I want to make a couple of points to put this in perspective, the way some scholars in this region are seeing this, because we're closer to the hegemon on this side. From my point of view, what we're seeing here, it's a geopolitical confrontation from a United States that is seeking to reassert its hegemony and leading its idea of the international liberal order. There are many different things, and we're seeing either a unipolar world led by the West, by the United States and its European allies and Canada, or a multipolar world in which Russia and China play other roles. It's a crisis in the post-Cold War order, in which the U.S. hegemonic domination is being challenged, and unfortunately, that is playing out in Ukraine, and there's no doubt that the invasion of Ukraine is a violation of the international law and committed by the Russians, and the Ukrainians are the ones that are going to suffer the most. It's unfortunate in this situation. Now, from the another perspective in this is trying to explain why from Latin America, this response is not as monolithic as some of the other speakers have pointed out, as well as in Southeast Asia and other regions of the world. Essentially, from Latin America, I mean, the people that are in critical thinking and want to see this from the global South perspective, is basically that the rise to Western Europe happened basically in what some may call, from the Marxist perspective, the primitive accumulation of capital, and that colonialism, Western colonialism, led to the rise of this European and Western strength, and that, for example, Spain took the gold, and Portugal took gold and silver from all these regions and built and Britain, you know, had a big part in this situation also. Also, they helped finance the settler colonies in Canada and the United States and Australia, and that was what built today's West, so to speak. Now, and also when the colonial situations ended in many of our regions, in many of our areas, when the Spanish troops and the Portuguese troops and British, so to speak, in some ways, left and put down their flags, but there was many of our countries were left in a condition of dependent development, and there's a whole school in Latin America that has developed that idea of dependent development. We're not going into that now. As to briefly the reaction, also in the same way that previous speakers have referred to, of different Latin American states to the situation, taking several votes that have been taken in the United Nations, and the last one yesterday, for example, that other speakers were referring to. It's interesting that there are three basic responses. It's not also a monolithic response. We have to take into account that Latin America is also much more influenced, I mean, the Western Hemisphere from the United States, and in many ways culturally is more influenced by the West. So we have that there are three main responses, or three main positions that, interestingly, or not surprisingly, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua have either abstained or refused to condemn Russia, although openly have not supported this, because there's one key important thing here. And speaking of non-alignment, as before, Cuba was also one of the leaders of the non-alignment movement since the early 60s, and was president twice. This really clashes with the whole idea of non-intervention. So a small nation like Cuba that has been facing US aggression for 60 years and have really tried to maintain a sovereign act and defend non-intervention in internal affairs and this kind of action is impossible. That should openly support an invasion of another country, whatever it is. So it's a very tense situation diplomatically. It's not the first time that Cuba was in this situation. It was also in 1979 when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and Cuba was the president of the non-aligned movement. So it's this tension there in understanding this whole thing from the global south, from non-alignment, and from the situation at this point. There's also countries like more that have supported more the US line in Latin America, more countries that are more to the right in the region. But interestingly, there are states like Brazil. Bolsonaro has declared neutrality. And it's interesting that it is not because he defends in a global south perspective, is basically a pragmatic view of the kind of relationship that Russia has built with Brazil over the years, the last few years. El Salvador is another country that even abstained yesterday from the vote on the United Nations Human Rights Council. And Mexico, who has developed a very robust I wouldn't say anti-imperialist, but more like third world perspective and more Latin American approach that the whole Latin American region was claiming for a long time. So it's different, as I said, in a region who has been or identified by the United States as its backyard, has been a victim of U.S. imperialism and U.S. interventions, but the responses are different. Aligned with political positions, but also with pragmatism in some cases. I will end here and be happy to take questions.
Great, thanks, Raul. We'll definitely come back and explore some of your comments on anti-imperialism and more on the non-aligned movement. But for now, we can move on to commentary from David Adler.
Thanks so much. Hey, everyone. My name is David Adler. I run an organization called the Progressive International, which unites different political parties and social movements and trade unions in different parts of the world, which gives me a certain perch to speak with some of the leaders, especially in Latin America, from where I'm speaking to you now, about their views on the conflict and what they think it means for a kind of tectonic shift in global geopolitics that is already underway. Now, many of the people who've spoken already on this panel have pointed to the General Assembly and votes of condemnation or abstentions on condemnation. And my main arguments today is to say that I think that the map of condemnation abstention is less important than the map of economic sanctions that have been set against Russia, right? Beyond the kind of diplomatic theater of to condemn or not to condemn, we need to actually look at the substance of these countries' foreign policies and how they're choosing to engage with the war. And what we see in that, in looking at that map of sanctions, is two things. One thing is we see that, many people have spoken about this as an opportunity for the US to reassert its hegemony in the world, or at least to band together its allies. And there we can see, I think we need to be honest, that the US has been extremely successful in this effort, that cohering a coalition that includes European allies on the continent who were flirting themselves with concepts of strategic autonomy, including people like Macron, who are strong defenders of NATO in principle, were already beginning to inch away in the Trump years from an Atlanticist coalition, but also including Japan, Australia, South Korea, New Zealand. So it's really important that we reckon with the fact that that pole in this conversation on multipolarity is really strong and has been rehabilitated. And NATO has been breathed new life. Many people here in this conversation will be familiar with the kind of wave of attacks against dissenters, people who kind of question the US policy from the North, right? If you're sitting in a country like the United Kingdom, if you're sitting in the United States, if you're sitting in France and you question these policies, it's a really, it's a time of not only kind of the formation of intense consensus, but I think a new kind of Cold War feeling in the air and in the atmosphere about how this war should be waged. But beyond that narrow coalition, as many people have said, there's very few countries who are participating in these sanctions, including many of the largest countries in the world, of course, China, India, Brazil, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Indonesia, even NATO member Turkey, but much more importantly, some of these smaller countries for whom participating in sanctions is a privilege, for whom the ability to say no, we're going to go without imports from Russia, energy imports from Russia is not a luxury that they can afford. So, Urvashi, many people have spoken about India, and I think it's critical that we focus on India as a huge player in this space, but I think it's equally critical that we focus on other countries for whom the prospects of non-alignment, as Raul mentioned, are much more alive, and for whom that principle of non-alignment is going to become increasingly important, especially in Latin America. So why bring up sanctions as the critical content of this conversation? Because in Latin America, sanctions are reality. I mean, Raul is speaking to us from a country that has suffered under an embargo for 60 years, right? So here, the question of sanctions as a legitimate weapon of economic warfare is really front of mind. Whether or not we engage in these sanctions has less to do fundamentally with whether we agree with Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine or special military operation, as people have mentioned before, much more to do with the idea that if we legitimize that same economic weapon, it's going to swing back around and come to hit the countries in this hemisphere. And so I think it's really helpful to see, as Raul was suggesting, we see from the perspective of, let's say, Argentina, right? So Argentina, they condemned the war in the General Assembly. But they said also, Argentina does not believe that sanctions are a mechanism to generate peace and harmony or generate a frank dialogue table that serves to save lives. Now, saying that in the annals of the European Union or in Washington, D.C., it's complete heresy. The idea that sanctions are not A, legitimate, and B, effective, right? Just questioning those two things is considered completely out of line. But for most of these countries in the hemisphere, of course, it's not. So I think it's helpful. Let's get in time the Argentine mind, and I'm sure many of the people among the 45 participants of this call have been thinking about this, right? You've got the U.S., who just recently under Trump forced through the largest loan in the history of the IMF in order to keep Macri in power, stating openly that that was the goal of the IMF program, despite the fact that it violated its own bylaws and they ignored warnings from their own staff to drive through a loan that imperiled the Argentine economy, led to a wave of capital flight. Okay, that's the US position. Then you've got Europe, which of course blocked the TRIPS waiver actively, and Germany is still blocking the TRIPS waiver to prevent the diffusion of critical vaccine technology to Argentina. And then you've got Russia, on the other hand, who was out there flying in with Sputnik vaccines. And of course, the Chinese, who are, contra the IMF position, providing loans that are not, ideal in terms of their conditionalities, but are certainly more substantive and less rapacious than those of the IMF. So for those reasons, I'm a lot more hopeful about the prospects for a new non-aligned movement. And certainly in my conversations that I've had, and my tilt, as the title of my organization suggests, is towards the left side of the political spectrum. But my conversations with the incoming government in Chile, with Gustavo Petro, who is likely to become Colombia's next president, and my conversations with the PT in Brazil, the prospect for that, for non-alignment to become a new call as we move into that multipolar world, I think will only become louder. Certainly, I think this conversation needs to proceed from the basis, and I'm sure many of my co-panelists will contest this, that we are already in a new Cold War. Many people have been predicting that the US and China would end up in some kind of new Cold War footing, but I think we're already in that footing, and the immediate eviction of Russian cats, of Russian athletes, of Russian culture from these institutions of the West, I think reflects this, as does the US position led by Joe Biden of this summit for democracy, right? We're back in a world in which concepts of free world and slave world are somehow legitimate, not just legitimate, are the basis for US foreign policy, right? So we're already seeing, of course, with the usual exceptions, Modi's democratic credentials never come under question in that conversation. Rarely do Erdogan's, nor do Bolsonaro's. But the point is that the US has clearly has moved already and is increasingly moving towards a Cold War footing. Now, I agree, I think, with many people here that for the US, and here I speak as a citizen of the United States and someone who's been deeply involved in thinking through the questions of the evolution of US foreign policy, I see all of this as a dry run. I mean, I see really the US approach to the Russian invasion as an opportunity for the US to test the strength of its coalition, the limits of its sanctions policies, to fine tune how can we perfect the art of economic warfare so that we can cripple foreign reserves, right? The big anxiety hanging over the United States for decades has been the accumulation of US debt by the Chinese. Now we're thinking about how we can paralyze that instrument so that we're less vulnerable, so that the weaponized interdependence moves in one direction and not in both. Right. And so I think that, once we accept that frame, we can see that this is less, that this war is in many ways a reflection or a product as much as a producer of that new Cold War footing. So I think, once we get into that, Ahmed has spoke a bit about the behavior of the United States in the last Cold War as being a driver of the present conflict. I think we don't have to look that far back. We can look at how the U.S. is behaving now, and especially in the hemisphere, in the transition from more overt modes of intervention, like coups, invasions, and armed shipments, to more covert forms of intervention, namely economic sanctions that allow them to externalize the cost of intervention towards the governments themselves, to say, we've crippled the Cuban economy or the Venezuelan economy through U.S. sanctions and our control of the global dollar system, but then we get to say, oh no, it's Maduro's fault, or it's the Cuban Communist Party's fault for the economic challenges that they face as a result of those policies. So I'll conclude with just sharing Gautam's optimism, whether not from a South Asian perspective, but from a Latin American perspective, to say that here the only option is a kind of non-aligned position. And so wanting to have good relations with all governments has only become an increasingly important position as the US moves away from thinking about Ukraine as a kind of laboratory for a certain Cold War proxy conflict towards that position vis-a-vis China. And I really do believe that that's the world that we're heading towards. And as the new poles create intense cross pressure for countries, not big countries necessarily like India, but smaller countries in Southern Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, I think there's going to be much more of a push towards a coherent position on non-alignment. There's no doubt that there will be countries who stick to a much more ad hoc position on strategic autonomy, but I do think that we will likely see the formation of new blocs that are committed to that non-aligned principle in more than just kind of ad hoc and interventions. Thanks.
Hi, thanks, David. Those are some really great comments on economic sanctions. And I hope that that's a theme that we'll have time to give a little more coverage to. There are quite a few questions, but before we get to the Q&A, let's get Atul Bhardwaj's input as well. Hi, Atul.
Hi, Juvaria, thanks a lot. And can you hear me? Okay, brilliant. I've heard this, and I would much agree with David, actually. His position. That's the whole war is playing according to the American strategic plans. If you see, America has been able to divide Russia and Germany to an extent, and its primary aim is anti-Putin, basically a regime change in Russia. It would like to have another Yeltsin kind of a person who is manageable, who's pliable, and would like to have, and then basically Russia is not America's peer competitor at this stage. In this particular Cold War 2.0, the peer competitor is China, and eventually the aim of Americans' aim is to get Russia into its own pocket and to cause the Sino-Russian split. That is the exact strategy which was played out in the Cold War I, when the Sino-Soviet split was the most crucial element of the American strategy. What we are seeing here is the same thing. Sanctions, excessive pressure on Russia is eventually going to, have some impact on Putin. And it's going to have, in fact, a great deal of political impact on Putin's presidentship. Now, how he's able to manage and how his allies like China are able to manage this. India would not definitely be in this particular endeavor to save Putin. India may at the moment support Russia, but if it comes to the issue of saving Putin, India will not do that. India is with Russia and India is not pro-Putin. It has to be very clear. It may appear to be pro-Putin at the moment for diplomatic reasons, but strategically, India is too intricately tied with the Americans. Indian elite is too intricately tied with the Americans to even think of, opposing it, when at the moment it doesn't matter to the US also. But the moment if you see the theater of war at any given time later, in the following decade, if you see the theater of war shifting to Indo-Pacific, then the things would be very different. And then all that, even you hear John Mearsheimer talking of strategic restraint in vis-a-vis Russia, that same restraint would not apply when the theater of war shifts to Indo-Pacific. So America is currently, America has lived with Crimea in Russia's pocket for last 8 years. And the realist restraint, advocates of realist restraint like John Mearsheimer and others, basically are saying, so what if Georgia or Ukraine is with Russia? What is more important for them is that Russia should be with the West. Russia should not go east. That is the most crucial element in this whole thing. And of course, as Oz has mentioned earlier, his earlier talk, that oil is another big factor. American shale companies are looking for new markets in Europe, and it will take time for them to develop these markets. But once they are off from Russia, Russia will be in a much weaker position and in a much easier for America to control. And not just control Russia, but also control China. Because once this entire Eurasian land bridge, which is coming up, in which Germany, US and others Germany, Russia and China, if they combine, that really impacts the US primacy to a great deal. And that is what America does not want. And if it is able to now, weaken Russia further and further, that would serve its strategy much stronger. As far as India's position is concerned, I would love to answer that later. But, another issue which has been discussed is about the sovereignty issue and the self-determination issue, which has been, taken up during these discussions. And according to international norms, Putin's use of military force against Ukraine is a direct assault on the principles of self-determination of all peoples. His intention to deny Ukraine the right to choose its military partner violates the principles of sovereignty. And this is as per the international law. Sovereignty and self-determination are the twin pillars of the post-war international order. And Putin feels that the right of self-determination bestowed on Ukraine by international law is a travesty of history and a brutal insult to Russia. According to President Putin, Lenin moved to place Donbass under Ukrainian jurisdiction, and this is in 1920s, was nothing but delirious. It is ironic that Putin is critical of Lenin for introducing the concept of a federative state with its entities having the right to secede, but supports the self-determination rights of the people of Crimea and Donbass. Now, this contradiction actually lies at the heart of international relations today. If you see, Lenin started working on the idea of self-determination at the time of its inception in political discourse more than 100 years ago. Putin is reviewing it after the idea has been profaned over the years by its misuse for Western imperial expansion. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, the anti-colonial nationalist movements in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East started germinating. The American and the German capitalists were keen to end the British domination of the world and reconfigure it for their own markets to grow. The Marxists saw the self-determination movement as a pragmatic means to mobilize the revolutionary zeal of the masses. Exactly what the right wing in most of the countries of the South are doing at the moment. It was in this context that Lenin wrote in July 16, the dialectics of history are such that the small nations, powerless as an independent factor in the struggle against imperialism, play a part as one of the ferments, one of the bacilli, which help the real anti-imperialist force, the socialist proletariat, to make its appearance on the scene. So this is exactly, leftists try to use this self-determination philosophy to advance politically. Similar thing is being done by the right wing today in most of the countries of the South. If you see in India, the liberal left is adopting a position which has always been adopted, that Putin has invaded, Putin has violated the international law, he's assaulting international order. But the right wing, interestingly in India, is supportive of Putin. Right wing, which is in power in India, and their supporters are supporting Putin and saying he's done the right thing, because they see that tomorrow they also would be able to intervene and grab whatever land they intend to grab. So Rosa Luxemburg and many other socialists opposed Lenin at that particular time. His radical articulation of the idea advocated international revolution and not nationalism as a route to working class emancipation. This is Rosa Luxemburg. So however, Lenin identified the socialists opposed to self-determination as a great nation chauvinists who approved the dominant nation's oppression over other nations. Now, similar disputes prevailed regarding the question of self-determination within the capitalist world as well. Americans remained ambivalent about the Wilsonian endorsement of the right of self-determination throughout the interwar years, and even after the end of the World War II. For example, the Atlantic Charter of 1941 only gave broad hints of the fundamental anti-colonialism inherent in American conception of the post-war world without fully endorsing the principle of self-determination. So nobody, neither the Americans nor the Soviets were actually, Soviets were of course in favor of self-determination, but Americans were a little ambivalent till early 50s. So post-war, the rise of the decolonization demand further signified the right of self-determination of the nations, and the principle was enshrined in the UN Charter. Interestingly, the United States voted against the 52 UN General Assembly resolution, claiming self-determination as a human right without realizing how important the principle would be to advance the American century. The process of creation of newly independent nation state was accompanied by redrawing their borders using ethno-nationalist insurgencies. This made the anti-colonial nationalists the new imperialists. Now, this is interesting here. For some Kashmiris, Pakistanis, and even many Westerners in India, India is an imperial nation. For a section of the population in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Tibet, and Taiwan, Chinese imperial ambitions are the root cause of their problems. Similarly, Kurds feel the same about Iraq and Syria, and Ukrainians have been added to the long list of victims of this so-called in-frontier imperialism, or what is, some people have referred to as next-door imperialism. Now, the replacement of anti-colonial nationalism by ethno-nationalism has exposed the perils of self-determination. The right has to a large extent legitimized violent struggles that are inspired by identity politics. It is one of the main reasons that post-colonial era is marred by ethnic, religious, and cultural conflicts in erstwhile colonies. While self-determination was the nemesis of the formal empires, the idea proved to be a boon for the informal empires that manipulate insurgencies and internal divisions within nation states to arm twist them for violating human rights and fundamental freedoms to preserve their territorial integrity. And this is one of the main reasons for the war in Ukraine. Was Putin pushed to an extent to launch a war? And the CIA's involvement in Ukraine from 2014 is very, very evident and is now well documented. The growing demand of self-determination right creates international hotspots that require policing and so-called humanitarian interventions. Now, this has helped Western powers to determine the limits of sovereignty and use violations of human rights to advance its economic and security agenda. It is not just the great powers that use the self-determination right to advance their geopolitical interest, Small and medium powers also employ it as a part of their foreign policy. Islamabad often invokes the rights of Kashmiri people to use it against New Delhi. India abstained in UN General Assembly on resolution that condemned Russian aggression against Ukraine. Now, explaining India's stand, Ram Madhav, a prominent voice in the ruling party's foreign policy establishment, wrote that India could not have accepted Putin's basic proposition that Ukrainians were not a separate nation, without risking negating its stand on Tibet, Taiwan, and other occupied or claimed territories by China. So India abstained for this particular reason also, not just because it wanted to oppose America. Today, Putin is the main culprit for overt use of force, and the West, relying on soft power and arms supplies to manage the Ukrainian regime, is a lesser evil. The question is, can Putin's irredentism be a greater menace than the ceaseless American hegemonic wars? The former is indulging in frontier imperialism or next door imperialism, and latter is continuously engaged in triggering regime change and broader and border reconfigurations across the world that eventually facilitate imperial interventions. I'm just completing it. This is the last question that I'm asking. Isn't it time for international relations scholarship to review this right of self-determination within nation states and also make a distinction between a global hegemon and an in-frontier imperialist? I'll end there. I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Yeah, hi, Atul. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting you. Actually, a lot of what you're saying ties in very closely to some of the sort of broader themes that are already in the Q&A. So just in a few minutes, I'm just going to ask you to speak, more specifically about the tensions that sort of exist between non-alignment, neutrality, and anti-imperialism. How are they different, and where are they sort of contradictory? That's one thing. The other thing is just going back to one of the earlier commentaries on what we mean by strategic autonomy and how that ties into what you sort of discussed already. And thirdly, and this is a question from the audience, about economic sanctions and the liberal international order, like how legitimate is this order given how sanctions are sort of panning out and being received by different countries. But before I ask you to consider those, and I'll just ask the other panelists as well, I'd like to invite our colleague Peter Willits to ask a question as well. Hi, Peter, can you speak? I think you're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. I would like to some extent modify and challenge the way people are using the term non-aligned, non-alignment, and non-aligned movement. I've previously talked about NATO as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and say you can't, from the name, assume it's an organization concerned with fishing. I would take the same attitude over non-alignment. Just because there's an obvious linguistic meaning to non-alignment, it doesn't mean we should assume that the diplomacy of non-alignment has been in accord with that meaning. So it has always, I think, been the non-aligned movement, an organization of solidarity for countries of the South. And because that was the fundamental thing in the 60s and 70s being anti-colonial, in the 70s and 80s being pro-development and challenging the international economic order, when we get to the end of the Cold War, it does not produce the end of the non-aligned movement. And a lot of people have naively assumed that it disappeared. Well, it didn't. It was just news coverage of it disappeared. And it was, in fact, very important for many of the reasons people are now talking about, of many developing countries being opposed, for example, the unilateralism of the United States, opposed to the arbitrary imposition of sanctions and so on. And so when there was only one hegemon, there was no two sides to be neutral between, the non-aligned was still strong. What has destroyed the non-aligned is the Syrian civil war. So it's since 2011 that the non-aligned has really ceased to be an effective voice in international politics. And that's because traditionally, all the principles of non-alignment through from the ideas of the importance of the independence of each individual country, their sovereignty, non-interference, equality between countries, etc., etc., are being violated by all the foreign intervention in Syria on the side of all parties in the civil war, and the divisions, particularly in the Middle East, but also more widely, about who's taking sides with the Syrian government or with the rebels against the Syrian government. And the non-aligned, as far as I'm aware, have never managed to produce a statement about the Syrian civil war. So what would you expect them to do? Well, normally, the non-aligned response to any situation of you're caught under pressures by both sides, if there are two sides, or there's something that you object to, is you mobilize a diplomatic initiative. So you would have expected the non-aligned to have sent a group of heads of government to try and mediate in the Syrian civil war. And equally now, you would have expected in January and February this year that the non-aligned would have sent missions to Moscow and to the Washington and Brussels and so on to mediate. And they've not done that. So the non-aligned are not an option in this supposed new Cold War because they are too divided about the differences between autocracy and democracy, between the American attempts at world leadership and their absolute revulsion of the Russians. For many of those who are not willing to condemn the Russians, there's certainly revulsion. And just remember how few the countries were which voted with Russia in that General Assembly resolution. It's worth reading them out. Belarus, not a surprise. North Korea, not a surprise. Syria, not a surprise. And one little surprise, but not a big surprise, Eritrea. It's just those four countries were willing to side with Russia. So there's not going to be any strategic, moral, political balance between two hegemons coming out of this current situation. There's going to be a sense of what are the principles which can reunite the developing countries. And the fundamental problem is that the leadership of the non-aligned movement has been too often in the hands of people who are dictatorial, charismatic leaders. It's not quite so bad with Azerbaijan at the moment, but Azerbaijan is stuck with the fact that it actually has Russian troops in its territory as a peacekeeping force, and in this case, it's a genuine peacekeeping force, which inhibits its ability to engage in leadership. So I would ask people to think about using the words non-aligned and non-aligned movement a little more carefully. I've tried on an ad hoc basis to produce an argument. I hope it's reasonably coherent.
Thanks, Peter. Just before you go, could you introduce yourself very quickly?
Well, I've been at City University as a member of staff since 1973. I retired, and so I'm an emeritus member of staff since 2007. And I've written 2 books on the non-aligned, and I've done a contribution to the annual Registry of World Events on the non-aligned for the last 44 years. So it is one of my fields. My other field is NGOs.
Right, great, thank you. I can see David's hand up right now. David, would you like to respond?
Just very quickly, because Peter's points are very well taken. Oz brought this up in the introduction, but there's been very little conversation about a key concept that hovers over this whole debate, which is capitalism. And we haven't spoken a lot about the underlying, if we're going to be speaking about non-alignment, of course, we can't speak about the parallels between a present or potential or reinvigoration, we might say, Peter, of the existing non-aligned group or the formation of a new bloc, without speaking about the transformation in the global economy and the evisceration of socialism as a real prospect for any of these countries that are engaged in this conversation. I mean, to Atul's point, quoting, my position as being on the left for a long time in the face of this Russian aggression has been that, Lenin's, if we're talking about inter-imperial aggression, then Lenin's words from 100 years ago, the dictum, the turn imperialist war into civil war has never been more relevant, but the left is so weak, workers are so disempowered, and the prospect of socialism is so hazy that it seems kind of foolhardy to even think in those terms. But the reason why I think it's important that we do engage in a more fine-grained analysis of what the global capitalist economy looks like is because I think that it's there that we'll find, to Peter's point, some questions about the preconditions of the formation of a new non-aligned movement. I spoke briefly about the dominance of the US dollar in the global economy and the control that gives the United States government in particular over SWIFT and the ability to wage economic warfare in a very careful, fine-tuned, and effective way, right? So we can think about these questions of, a coming monetary multilateralism as not just being, reflections of a multipolar world, but as being preconditions for any substantial non-aligned movement to really emerge. In the absence of that deeper transformation in the global economy and its structure, I think it's really unlikely that we're going to end up with a full-throated, confident, and coherent non-aligned movement to form.
Great, thanks. Let's just take Atul's comment over here, and then we have quite a few questions from the audience. Atul?
I would definitely, Peter, raised this issue of non-alignment. And I definitely, have a different take on this entire issue of non-alignment. If you actually see the non-alignment, the initial non-aligned countries were, Egypt, India, Indonesia, and these are the basic countries. The Cuba joined in much later. And of course, Yugoslavia, Tito's. And Tito was no friend of Russia. Stalin, of course. He was more in the Western camp than in the. So all these are basically non-communist, non-aligned, neutral countries. And at that stage, one has to look at it from that angle. We've always looked at it from the angle of these non-aligned countries. But actually, did it suit the American strategy at that particular purpose to have this non-aligned countries? Of these, America did not want to take the responsibility of these big countries like India, Egypt, or for that matter, Indonesia. It was good for these countries to go, Russia to take care of them. America wanted to, increase Russia's Soviet Union's burden, and also it used this entire non-aligned movement to tell the Chinese, look, the way the Soviets are helping the Soviets are helping these non-communist countries and are not paying attention to the communist bloc. And this helped actually in the Sino-Soviet split later, which was the main agenda of the American grand strategy. Again, that split between Russia and China remains one of the key issues. This time, Americans are not chasing the Chinese. Americans are chasing the Russians. And once Putin goes, Americans' aim is to grab Russia and to make it more pliable. So this is non-alignment. I'm not too confident on non-alignment. I worked with Inderjeet on a little bit on the NIO, that is a new international order, which the global South propounded in the 70s, and how the US worked to break the third world unity on that. The oil countries, which were the Middle East countries in the oil, were divided into one block as considered as rich third world countries. Then the emergence of BRICS occurred from there. The India, Brazil was blocked into a separate thing. And then the third was the very poor countries, which the US was not really bothered about. And non-alignment to that extent in 1981, that is the time when the Washington Consensus started making inroads into India. And Indira Gandhi came back to power in 1981. And you see, she played a lovely game. She hugged Fidel Castro at a NAM summit. And on the other hand, she was coolly going and, getting the biggest loan from the IMF. So that was all, basically political stage. It was stage managed, all that. So I am not really confident about so much about the global south, because the moment things shift into the Indo-Pacific theaters, you'll have a very, very different, people singing very different songs. Thank you.
I can see Ahmed's hand up as well. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I think non-alignment as a formal structure, of course, doesn't exist the way it did in the Cold War. I think non-alignment, to use that word for the global South's reaction to the war, is probably a misnomer. But I will draw attention to two things. One, what Urvashi said, and she spoke about how the far right in India supports Russia in this, and similarly, you see the similar trends in Pakistan as well. So I might say that, the hegemonic and the imperialistic tendencies of the United States have unveiled themselves in the last 20, 30 years. So we might consider this to be a form of resistance towards an imperialistic agenda, or ostensibly an imperialistic US position, as opposed to a Russian position, which has not been as imperialistic in the eyes of the global South, compared to the United States. And secondly, David quickly, he pointed out about the economics of it. So, if you look at the abstentions, so you might say that these southern countries depend on the capitalist economies to sort of substantiate themselves and to reinvigorate themselves. So that abstention might show, or in one way demonstrate, that while they are precarious, they are concerned about their economic positions, however, they might also point towards the fact that the US-led order on democracy and human rights is not as moralistically held in southern circles as it used to be, for example, during the Cold War. So it is probably losing its moral edge, because of which those abstentions are happening, but they're not outrightly going against the United States because of the economic problems that they might face later on.
Sorry, I have a question from the audience, and I think Oz can take this perhaps, or anyone really, but let me just, it's from our colleague, Petros Iosifidis, who is a professor in media policy at City University of London, and he's also the author of the book called Digital Democracy, Social Media and Disinformation from Routledge, which includes case studies from Ukraine and Russia. And one of the basic arguments is that Russia uses disinformation via traditional and social media to convey messages. Now, has anything changed recently when it comes to disinformation? How this has facilitated justification for the invasion? And I mean, anyone can answer, but I'd like Oz to perhaps have a go at this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an avid follower of Russian media. So the information I've got on this really comes from the BBC monitoring service and their service looking at Russian information. Where my interests overlap with it are that it looks like the same techniques the Russians, in terms of disinformation, developed in Syria are actually being sort of almost carte blanche moved over and used for the Ukrainian war. So it looks like not much has sort of changed in the sense of it goes on. The nature of doing so looks to be incredibly similar to that's been developed over the Syria conflict. And in terms of audience and people buying it, it sort of tends to be that pro-government audiences in the Middle East are picking up on it and using it as sort of retweeting and retweeting Russian government sites and so forth. So that's kind of where the overlap sort of is occurring, if you like, as far as I can see it.
And thank you, Oz. While you're there, could you maybe pick up one more question that was directed to you from our colleague Sashi Kumar Sundaram about the implications of the war on EU's foreign and security policy towards the Middle East? Any reflection on the EU strategic compass document and its global impact?
Yeah, I think in terms of, I saw that question and it said sort of going beyond democracy, and I think that's probably the right way to view it. I think the crisis in Europe at the minute, top of the agenda, the sort of elephant in the room, if you like, is energy, and what energy policy looks like going forward. In terms of, the US has released its strategic reserves, and it said that it's going to do so for the next 6 months. that coincides with the exact same amount of time it takes to drill a new shale well. And so in the Permian, I imagine that new shale wells will start popping up quite speedily given the current oil price. In terms of the Middle East, however, it makes Qatar particularly important. So prior to this, Qatar has been has basically switched its strategy to really focusing on liquefied natural gas and making sure that you can get various terminals into Europe. As part of that, Europe's looking to expand those terminals, I think from 29 now to get slightly larger, 29, 30, something like that. The North Field looks like it's going to come online. And so it looks like Qatar, in terms of sort of European energy policy, is going to become quite central to sort of trying to diversify and fill the gap in terms of that. In terms of going beyond that, obviously, European interests are really entwined with what's going on. And by and large, I think Europe, slightly moving out of the Middle East, has its eye on what's going on in Afghanistan and what that's going to mean for refugee policy into Europe. And besides that element, I think really now the European focus is on Ukraine and how the Middle East can help Europe fill various strategic issues that it's got, the mess that it's got itself in terms of energy policy.
Thank you, Oz. So I think we're quite close to the end of the session now. So there are some questions we won't be able to address, but I do want every speaker to just have a minute or so to to share their final comments. Raul already has his hand up, so perhaps we can begin with him, and then Urvashi, Ahmed, and David, and then back to you all. Is that okay?
Okay, thank you. No, quickly, I just wanted to make one point, is when I referred to non-alignment, I was not advocating or not saying that we are at a moment in which you can see the recreation of the non-alignment movement. What I was saying is that specifically the Cuba's position at this point resembled or took some of these non-alignment principles, because being a country that has been facing the confrontation of aggression from the United States, that has defended non-aggression and the non-violation of the national integrity of nations, it couldn't possibly support the action of Russia by invading another country. But at the same time understands the how things play geopolitically speaking. And in at this point, from our point of view, the big winner of this up to now is the United States. I agree with some of the speakers saying that all these weapons that are being given to Ukraine, all this arsenal is going to be replenished by buying more weapons from the United States. NATO has taken a more active role. All these countries have increased their military spending, and it's a way of an empire in decline trying to reassert or trying to maintain his hegemonic and deliberate world order at this point. That was the points I was trying to make. So thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thanks, Raul. Urvashi, do you want to add some closing comments? Okay, I don't think she's here actually. Ahmed?
Yeah.
Oh, Urvashi, you're back.
Yeah.
You're back.
Yes, sorry.
Your final comments, please.
Well, I'd like to pick up on something that Atul had said, that the closeness between Indian elite and the US elite is quite a bit.
Hi, Urvashi, sorry, you're sounding very faint. Is your mic blocked or something?
Is it okay now? Is it better?
Yeah, that's better. That's better. Thanks.
Sorry. So I'd like to pick up on something that Atul had said. He had commented on the proximity between Indian and American elites, and I think I tend to agree with him over there that if we look at the larger perspective, and if we kind of zoom out, I too see India aligning much more with the United States than with Russia. But even as India will continue to preserve its core interests, and since this conversation was so much about non-alignment, so non-alignment was also understood in so many ways. It was also a strategy for India to maintain its independence and to survive as a newly independent nation at the time when non-alignment movement was in currency. Uh, so if there is a future for solidarities, if there is a future for countries to collaborate, obviously I'd be hopeful too, as Gautam Chakrabarti, as he pointed out as well. But I tend to have a sort of a bleaker perspective on this matter, and especially looking at the mood of the current opinion, I don't see a very bright future for non-alignment, at least in the South Asian part of the world. Yeah.
Great. Let's get some input from Ahmed.
Yeah, so I'll just sum up what I think this session implies. So first, I think that the flow of information and the way, US has projected itself on the global scale, especially during the war on terror and with its policies in the Middle East and elsewhere, that has changed the perception. And because Russia took a backstage, so that perception of an imperialist hegemon has now come to be challenged. So it's more of a resistance rather than a disjointed resistance of southern countries, rather than a non-aligned movement per se. The second thing is that the abstentions and the voting signifies probably that the degrading moral position of the Western-led world order. But yet, because these southern countries are still economically dependent on the Western world order, and hence, they cannot overtly challenge the US campaign and side with Russia.
Great, thanks. David, can you go next?
No, I've spoken quite enough. Thank you. I'm happy to, thanks for the questions. I wish I had more time to answer them, but no, I'll pass.
Oh, okay, sure. Atul then?
I would just make my last comments like this, that, we are on the cusp of a change. The global order is getting reconfigured. The oil supplies are getting reconfigured. The currency is getting reconfigured. Now, the SWIFT and all that may not matter a lot after some stage, because the US later on may come up with something known as the digital dollar. And once the digital dollar and endeavor to make it a mono currency, so the whole, so these wars have to be seen in the larger perspective of the changing world order and how it is being changed. Thank you.
You're mute, Juvaria.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I was saying that now we have Oz with the final word.
Well, I guess, given the time, if anyone wants to sort of get in touch with me, you can do so via Twitter at ozhassan.com, at ozhassan, or on my work email address, and we can sort of pick it up there. I guess the final thing to say is just sort of thank you for hosting this, Juvaria, and sort of stepping in. It's very good of you.
Oh, no problem at all. We missed Inderjeet, but hopefully he'll get to watch the video version whenever we can share it soon. Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for taking the time this afternoon to join us. Special thank you to the panelists. It was really, really interesting, and I hope we can do something similar in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much.